Good morning. We're going to do something a bit different this time around, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and it's a point that I think is of kind of interest. We're going to talk about performance measurement. How many of you find that performance measurement in your companies is rather a confused issue? Yeah. It's not an uncommon concept. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore and understand performance measurement. We're going to do it in an interesting way. We are going to have voting. You're going to raise your hand to make decisions. So let's see if we can have good audience participation. By the way, the overheads are available. We have information available if you'd like to get it, or if you have any questions, please contact me at Michigan State University and I'll be happy to talk with you. We're going to talk about performance measurement, and we're going to talk about why it's important, but more importantly, why does it cause us so much confusion? To do this, we have to really understand that currently, performance measurement, especially in the supply chain, is undergoing a radical transformation. And it's being characterized by three concepts. Number one, it is critical. It is one of the few things that businesses do that if you didn't have it, we would create it. We need feedback, we need information. Number two, it is confusing. Good example, on Wednesday of last week I was in Chicago, and I was listening to a mid-level group of purchasing executives, and it was obvious that they were looking at scoreboarding, but it was also obvious that they didn't really understand what performance measurement was and was not. And that's not common to them. In most companies, performance measurement is critical, but we don't know what to do with it. And it's changing. So let's talk about things. And by the way, what we're going to do this, we're going to talk about some basics, we're going to talk about rules, we're going to talk about challenges, we're going to talk about myths, we're going to talk about where it's going. All right. We're also going to give you a chance to participate. This is one part where it's not simply me up front. I'm going to be asking you to make decisions. Are we ready? Gosh, you people aren't excited. You look like my MBA class. No, thank you, I really needed that. All right, here's the first question. Are we ready? There are going to be 9 of them. Let's see how we do. Which is more important in the firm, strategy or performance measurement? How many of you vote for strategy? Hands up, the bulk of you. How many of you vote for performance measurement? The answer is performance measurement. Why is that? Here's the reality. In most companies, strategy, while important, is often vague and meaningless. How many of you have mission statements that read like, we are in the business of providing our customers with access to leading edge technology in a form that is user-friendly at a fair price. We also believe that people are our most important asset and we will invest in them. We also understand that we are members of the community and we must support that. And finally, we have a responsibility to our stakeholders, the stockholders who are the ultimate owners. Where did I get that? You go to Dilbert, you go to www.dilbert.com and you look for random mission statement generators. Why it's important, and this is why I brought up Dilbert, where Dilbert basically is focusing on this. What is really important? Here's what's important. Performance measurements take mission and it converts them into a form that makes sense to the people involved. In order to give you some idea of this, let me give you an idea. If you have a chance, there's a book you should look at. And what it does, by the way, let me get to that book in a minute. What performance measurement does is it takes the business model and it says, what do you have to do for us to succeed? Now, by the way, increasingly, I'm going to make a statement. I was watching the presentation with Laura in the other room, and she made a good point. Supply chain excellence doesn't make sense. We are only excellent in the extent to which we support the business model. And the business model is increasingly becoming the unit of analysis. Now, when we talk about the business model, we're talking about 3 elements. We're talking about how they interact. And the 3 elements are, who's our key customer? What's our value proposition? What is the customer value in terms of what do we have to do good enough? What do we have to do to win? And what do we have to avoid doing to lose orders? And finally, what do we have to achieve? What's the desired outcome? And These determine the frequency and form of performance measurement. In fact, I want you to read this. Let me give you a bit of background. In 2002, Margaret and Stone, which are two women, were associate editors in the Harvard Business Review. They wrote a book called What is Management? In the third chapter of the book, which was organized in terms of importance, they had a chapter called M&M, Mission and Metrics. And what they stated was the following, and I want you to read this. One of the most important management disciplines, the one more than any other keeps people focused and pulling in the same direction, is to make an organization's purposes tangible. Managers do this by translating the organization's mission, that is, what it particularly exists to do, into a set of goals and performance measurements that make success concrete for everyone. This is the real bottom line of every organization, whether it's a business or a school or a hospital. Its executives must answer the question, given our mission, how is our performance going to be measured? Here is what I do in many organizations. I start by looking at how you measure performance, and then I ask the question, does it align with how our mission statement is presented? If the two are at odds, guess which one wins? It's always performance measurement. Let's go on to the second question. What is the major purpose of performance measurement? Is it measurement control? Is it communication? How many of you will say measurement and control? Oh boy, no hands. How many of you will say communicate? How many of you are confused? The answer is communicate. Let's think about what's going on. What do performance measurements do? Performance measurements communicate. What do they communicate? Goals. What is it you're attempting to achieve? Number two, expectations. What's a good enough task? Number three, what are the consequences of either doing better than or less than what we thought we were going to do? They sell. And here's what we do. We sell it by talking about performance management when we talk with our top management. Why do we have to talk to top management in terms of performance measurement? Because our goal is very simply to say, if you support us, we will make you look better. And why do we need it? Because we need their commitments. We educate. Now, what do we think we educate people on? We do educate people on two aspects. The first aspect is what's important. How do you educate someone on what's important? By the way, again, if you didn't get this is called audience participation. How do you educate people on what is important? Okay, not only that, it's what you measure. If something is measured, what have you told someone? It's important. By the way, you also educate people on what's not important. How do you do that? By what is not measured. Let me ask a simple question. How many of you have a mission vision statement where one of the objectives is not measured? If you have that situation, you're not going to achieve it. And finally, it directs people. It directs people to gaps. And the gaps are the difference between where we are and where we should be. And finally, and this is the smallest, this is important, it allows the opportunity for correction. That is, if we give people information back, they find out what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and what they have to do in order to correct things. So it provides us with some important activities. Should we use the same measures throughout the firm? True or false? How many of you would like to see the same measures used throughout the entire organization? Hands up. Some of you. How many of you disagree? Okay, we have a lot of people who are now sitting on the fence. This is not acceptable. Remember, you have to commit. Okay, the answer is false. In order to answer this question, let me take you back. For a period of time, Michigan State University was involved with a company called Masco. Masco was a large company at this point consisting of 60 different companies. And what Masco did is they taught us this concept, which we refer to as 360 management. What is 360 management? Let me explain the diagram, because it is very important. The diagram says that you in supply chain, and by the way, notice, this is a supply chain centric diagram, because who is in the middle? You, and who are you? Okay, supply chain, you gotta get excited. Let's put it this way. We do more fun than the people like finance and accountants. In the States, I'm a member of the Society for the Prevention of Accountancy. Our motto is, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. Anyway, you're in the middle. Which groups do you need? Now I'm going to have you understand, you need superiors because they provide commitment, they provide resources. You need subordinates. By the way, notice the terminology. You also need upstream people, suppliers. You also need downstream people, customers. Now notice there are two sets of circles. The first set of circles, the inner circle, is the internal. So we have immediate suppliers, immediate superiors, immediate subordinates, internal suppliers, internal customers. And then we have external customers, external suppliers. Do they all talk the same way? For example, let's take a look, for example, with top management. We need top management. Why do we need them? Well, first of all, we need them in order for them to provide validity to what we do. How do we communicate? Top managers don't care how things are done. What do they focus on? Outcomes. Did you achieve it? How many of you have tried to talk to your top management about Lean, Six Sigma, process analysis, and what's been the response? Sleeping, or they have a glazed expression followed by immediate desire to hit the bar. By the way, they're going to be interested in things like sales, market share, quality problems related. Why? Because we have to talk to them to get their support. So we're going to talk to them in terms of measures that are reported after the fact. Those measures, by the way, we want to get their resources because we want to get time. Those resources have a problem for us because that's one way, but if you talk to subordinates or suppliers, what's the problem with after the fact measures? What's the problem with telling someone that the order is late? What's the fundamental problem with that? If the order is late, how much of an ability do they have to correct it? Zero. Therefore, the measure becomes what? Punitive. So now what you have to think about is output measures, which are critical to top management, become useless to the people in the system because they're simply scorekeeping. How do you report them? You need what's known as predictive or process measures. By the way, the concept of predictive or process measures was first developed by Texas Instruments. And the reason they developed these measures is because they came to the realization that our goal was to prevent problems, not to correct them after the fact. And so these are measures which are typically associated with the process. And by the way, they're also measures that help us identify the desired outcome by saying, what is it in the process we have to do in order to make the desired outcome be achievable? I'll give you an example. How many of you are interested in lead time? Short lead times are important. Anyone? Oh my God, okay. This is interesting. Usually I get people who are interested in lead times. Supposing your goal is to reduce lead times, what would you measure in the process? What things would be correlated with shorter lead times? Changes that would either result in lead times being predicted to go up or predicted to go down. Say again? Say again? Okay, time in the process. Anything else? Batch sizes. By the way, batch sizes are dependent upon setup times. How about things like, if our goal is to reduce lead times, here's an example. How about number of steps in the process? As the number of steps in the process go up, what should we expect lead time to do? Go up. How about distance covered? How many of you measure distance covered in your process? By the way, that's an interesting measure. I'll give you an example. How many of you have ever seen a 3M command strip? You know those strips that are used to put things up on walls? 3M investigated that strip in the States. They found out one of their batches traveled over 1,600 miles. How about the number of people who touch an order? Every time someone touches an order, what do? They leave behind cost. What else do? They leave behind lead time. How about setup times? The larger the setup times, the larger the batches, the larger the batches, the longer the lead times. So this gets back, what's interesting is you use process lead times, process measures to talk to subordinates and to suppliers. You use output measures to talk to customers and to talk to top management. Very different orientation. By the way, this is one of the most interesting things. As we move forward, the supply chain manager of the future has got to be able to talk to these two groups using the appropriate set of measures. All right, how about this one? Measures and metrics are the same thing. I have gone to many presentations and I have seen people use the term measures and metrics, and I see them using them interchangeably. Are they the same thing? How many of you think that they are? Hands up. All right, how many of you disagree? And the answer is, you're right. Good one. By the way, this is important because this is a fundamental issue of precision. Here's the difference. What's a measure? It's a verifiable. By the way, notice that. Measures must be verifiable. What does that mean? If I give you the data and I give you the method, what should you be able to do? Get to the same number. And they're stated in quantitative terms, and they're intended to close the gap between value strategy and specific activities. Traditionally, their things are they measure. Yes, that's appropriate. They teach, and they direct attention. But what do metrics do? Metrics bring together three things. Anyway, the three things, and apparently they didn't come back on this. We're going to try this again. That's it. Sometimes the computers become ornery things. What are the three things they bring together? Number one, they bring together measures. A measure is a number. How many of you remember Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? One of the best books ever written. By the way, it also caused me a lot of problems many years ago because I'm going to tell you the story. This actually happens. I live in Haslett, Michigan. My in-laws lived in Toronto, Ontario, and we would visit them fairly frequently. Now, when our children were young, we found out it's 4 hours and 45 minutes to go from door to door. Now, how many of you have children, and how many of you have tried to drive for about 5 hours? What do you think the biggest question you get is? Are we there yet? Okay, so when my kids were small, I found out that the BBC radio special of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was 5 hours. I played that. My son loved it. Now, one of the problems was the major character in the thing was called Arthur Dent. And whenever Arthur had a problem, he would say, "That's it, we're all going to die." Now, my son goes to grade 2. And in grade 2, he gets his first exam. And he now gets stressed. Guess what he says? "That's it, we're all going to die." Now, our school district is very sensitive to these issues. Do you know how quickly you can get brought into the school psychiatrist's office to discuss this issue? So here I am discussing, and my wife is with me because I was called out from the office because this was an issue. And the woman, apparently, who had humor surgically removed from her, looked at me, she said, "Tell me about this. Where did it come from?" "Well, it comes from the Hitchhiker's Guide from the Galaxy." "What is it?" "It's a comedy." "Well, tell me about it." "Well, it begins with the Earth being destroyed to make way for a hyperspace bypass." "And you find that funny, Dr. Melnyk?" "Well, it is, after all, one of the minor planets." And this is not going well. And I know it. And so at this time, I'm almost ready to give up because I'm trying to explain things. And I look at the psychiatrist, and I say, "It's at times like this I wish I'd listened to what my mother had told me." "And pray tell, Dr. Melnyk, did your mother tell you? I don't know, I never listened to her. And there's my wife just shaking her head, closing her eyes and saying, we have yet to adjust his medication just right. Anyway, so we're bringing things together. A measure is meaningless. 42. To make a measure meaningful, we have to add a standard. What's expected? And by the way, what's the third aspect? You have to add a consequence. This is a three-legged stool. And what's important about a three-legged stool is that if you put the three legs together, it makes measures powerful because it motivates people. It tells them what they're going to be measured on, what's expected, and what's going to happen if they either surpass it or don't surpass it. Measures are interesting. Metrics are critical. How many of you have metrics in your organization versus measures? How many of you have measures primarily? That is problematic. Before we leave this, a couple of observations. Number one, a metric without a standard is meaningless. Which means if you don't have a standard, how do I know what's expected? Number two, a metric with the wrong standard is dangerous. Okay, well, let's go on. When it comes to measures, the more the better. Yes or no? How many people say yes? More measures, more accuracy, more triangulation, more insight, we can nail the bugger. Versus the fewer the better. How many go with more? Hands up. Fewer. The answer is, you're getting to know this. This is not fun. I'm supposed to be pulling the rug from underneath you. Anyway, let's take a look. By the way, I want you to think about the Goldilocks principle. Remember Goldilocks with the porridge? What did she find? The first bowl of porridge, the Papa Bear's bowl of porridge was too hot. The Mama Bear's porridge was too cold. And the baby bear's porridge was just right. Here's the point. Measures are best if there are not too few. If there are too few, what do you have happen? You have what's referred to as overfocus. One of my friends, and if you ever come down to my neck of the woods, you have to meet him. And I was talking to the group yesterday who took my workshop, is Randall Schaefer. Now, Randall is an interesting character. He graduated from University of Wisconsin with a degree in philosophy, only to find out that there's much demand for philosophy. So he became a production supervisor. Now, in becoming a production supervisor, well, apparently, he now describes himself as an industrial philosopher. He's really neat. The guy is amazing. Anyway, so what happened to him is he had the following problem. He has an order that management says is critical. So he goes down and he goes to see the guy who's going to take and put the metal coil on the machine and stamp out the part, right? So he goes down to him and he sees that this guy's got a big metal coil running. And he says, you've got to take that off, put mine on, because we made a promise to the customer. We said it's going to be ready for tomorrow, and we're committed. Now, this is the guy who's politically incorrect. You know, the one who used to, remember, how many of you remember the people on the floor who would have a cigar hanging out of their mouth? Okay, he looks at them and says, right. Next morning, he comes down, and guess what he sees? The coil that's been previously mounted is still running. And he says, why are you doing this? What you're doing is building inventory. We don't need that. We need this order. And the guy manning the machine said, you don't understand, college boy. Let me explain what's going on. I get measured on uptime. And if I take this coil off and put your coil on, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to look bad. So you're going to just wait. What did he have? Overfocus. Focusing on one measure. If you have too many measures, how many of you have too many? I was in one company, they had 400. Yeah, 400. They had 400 different ways of measuring cost. What you have, first of all, is confusion. Which one is important? All of them. Number two, you have gamesmanship. What's gamesmanship? It's what you see with your kids. How many of you have had small children and you've had the following? If you don't eat your vegetables, you cannot have any dessert. What did your children wind up doing? How many bites of the vegetables do I have to eat before I can get this? How about the third thing? You focus on what you do well. Instead of looking at everything, it's like, I do well on these measures. Look at them. Aren't they great? What's the reality? Now this is based on research. For decision makers, people who actually use the measures to make decisions, 5 plus or minus 2. That means a minimum of 3, a maximum of 7. If you have less than 3, you have overfocus. If you have more than 7, you have confusion. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about it. If you have to have more than 7, what do you think you have to do? If you need more than 7 measures, what do we have to do? You've got to drop something. By the way, you should measure what you can, what you need, not what you can. How many of you are measuring things and it's not quite right? You know, it's like the joke told many years ago about the young boy at night, and he was looking for something under a street light. The police officer comes up and says, "Young man, what's happened? I lost my money." "Where did you lose it?" He points off into the darkness. "Then why are you looking here? The light's better." By the way, how about avoiding conflicts in measures? How many of you have systems where there is an inherent conflict between at least 2 measures? Let me give you what happened to me. There's a cereal company, I can't tell you the name. I can tell you it's in the Midwest. I can tell you that they have a spokesman who's a tiger who really views his product as being great, but I can't tell you more than that. Some years ago, for the Sydney Olympics, this is some time ago, this company decided that they were going to package all of the cereals in packages written in the language of the participants. So if you were from Russia, it was going to be in Russian. If you were from Germany, it was going to be in German. If you were from Australia, it was going to be in Australian. And if you were from France, it was going to be in German. Anyway, they wound up having to do it in Indianapolis because the major plant for this was Indianapolis. This plant, the year before, had gone through a process where they had restructured the line and they eliminated the buffer between the production and packaging line. The manager was measured on uptime. How do you think this person responded when told that he was going to have to do a lot of frequent changeovers just to accommodate these different boxes? How would you respond? What's that? It's basically not exactly happy. So what he asked management is, take me out of because the way they evaluated performance is he was evaluated relative to the other production managers. And management said, we won't, but we'll remember. At which point he said no. And what they wound up doing literally is they rented a warehouse in downtown Indianapolis. They would take the boxes off the production line after they were filled, take it across town, rip it open again, and repackage it. Well, management learned. You know what they did? They put another measure in place. The measure was adherence to marketing changes. What do you think the problem is between adherence to marketing changes and uptime? You can't do both. So we have a problem. By the way, measures have life cycles. What does that mean? Sometimes they're no longer relevant. Sometimes the issues are no longer important. It's not important. They've got to be killed. And by the way, aware about bad data. A lot of times we assume data is good. In many cases, the data we're dealing with is problematic. Okay, measures are accurate indicators of performance. True or false? How many of you say true? Oh boy, this is lack of participation. How about false? The answer is false. Why is that? Here's the reality. Measures are imperfect proxies of performance and outcomes. What does that mean? By the way, it means a couple of things. I'll give you a prime example. This actually happened. Japanese company, newspapers. What they do, if you print newspapers, is you put a 5-ton roll of paper and you whip it through a press at very high speeds. What's the worst thing that can happen when you're whipping that paper through the press at high speeds? It breaks. By the way, interesting thing, that occurs, and I remember once I was in England and I went down to Fleet Street where they printed, and they have a guy still on the floor called a flycatcher. Now, what's a flycatcher? In the old days, when they used to have single sheets, the flycatcher was the guy when they printed the single sheets and a piece of paper flew away, he picked it up. It was called a fly. They still had it, even though they had the 5-ton, reams of paper. And I asked him the question, if the thing breaks, what are you going to do? To which he said, run like hell. Anyway, so they're imperfect measures. In Japan, a newspaper company, which was worried about this, asked a simple question. How do I measure my supplier's paper so that I can minimize the probability of it breaking? Here's the point. You can get proxies, for example, thickness, density. Problem is, they're not perfect. And by the way, one more comment. Just because the numbers look right doesn't mean that the desired changes haven't taken place. And let me give you an example of this. 2011, I was working in my office, and I got a telephone call from a drug company in North Carolina. We want you to come down and become a consultant. No. Why not? Because I'll tell you you're an idiot and you don't want to hear that. So they said, name a figure. I named a figure. And I said, not only that, but you have to pay me for travel time. Fine, done. That's the point I knew immediately the number was too low. So at that point, I went down to North Carolina, and what happened was, here's what this company was. This company had competed on price. Now they were competing on responsiveness. They were a contract manufacturer to another company. And the other company wanted something simple. High quality drugs, high responsiveness, and no matter what happens in the supply chain, we get delivery. That's what management looked at. They looked at fill rates. The problem was, this company couldn't do it. It really had problems, and it was traced back to the measurement system. They measured cost. In a company where your primary product, your primary output was quality, they had only one measure for quality. They had 400 measures for cost. By the way, how did the people in the customer company manage it? They kept 68 weeks of inventory on hand. The measures looked right because the fill rates were superb. No one ever bothered to look at what was happening underneath. Okay, how about this one? A company that tried to change its strategy from lean to innovation. And this was one I was personally involved with again. They started to measure innovation as anything that happened. They put a new paint finish. Guess what? Innovation. They put a new handle. Innovation. Not quite exactly what was required. Okay. By the way, measures are subject to the telephone game phenomenon. How many of you remember the telephone game? Anyone played it? What is the telephone game? The telephone game is, remember the series where the teacher starts off and she or he whispers a name or a phrase to the first person, and you kind of repeat that? Guess what happens by the time it finishes? It gets distorted. That is true in performance measurement. Performance measurement are subject to distortion as they move through the system. Okay, measurement problems indicate problems in performance. True or false? True. False. The answer is, it depends. Now, let me give you the background for this. There's this concept called Surfcall. And what Surfcall says is there are six opportunities for error. I'm going to show you the fact there are 6 opportunities for errors in measures. What's the first opportunity for error? Gap 1, when we don't understand our key customer. If we don't understand our key customer, what's the problem? We may not understand what they value. Guess what? That's going to cause a fundamental problem. Notice what gap 2 is. When we don't state the right standard, what the customer expects. What's gap 3? Gap 3 is what we think of. It's the performance gap. Oh, by the way, gap 4 is kind of interesting. That's what we tell the customer. That's called the lying gap. By the way, what's gap 5? Gap 5 is feedback between what people think they're doing and what they're actually doing. If you provide feedback too infrequently, people think they're doing better than they actually are. What's gap 6? Gap 6 is where we look at the measures and we identify opportunities to improve the system for the customer. What does this diagram say? It says if we have a performance measurement problem, it's not a problem necessarily of performance. It could be a problem because we don't know who our key customer is. Let me ask a simple question. How many of you in your companies know exactly who your key customer is? How many of you don't? Okay, here's the reality. If you don't know who your key customer is, I can predict what you're going to measure. Cost. Why will you measure cost? It's the universal bottom line. And in some cases, it's the worst thing to do. Okay, how about this one? By the way, there's a new term. I was in England some years ago and I was talking with Michael Bourne, who does a lot of research in performance measurement. And he's saying that right now the Europeans are doing something known as future forwardcasting. What's forwardcasting? He points out the following. If you focus on the past, that is 100 years on the past, then the measures become seen as being punitive. They punish people. What did he ask for? As he pointed out, the past is done, move on. What's forwardcasting? Take a look at your performance and ask the first question. Are the future goals still relevant? Are they too easily attained, in which case should they be ramped up? Are they no longer feasible, in which case we want to ramp it down? Then, let's measure our progress against the goal and ask the question, what do we have to change in order to achieve that goal? And if you're on track, you keep going. If you're not, you identify what it is we have to make things change. What the purpose is very simply, it says, let's focus on the future. Okay, within the supply chain, measures should be aligned, true or false? How many people say measures should be aligned? How many people say false? The answer is, here's what I mean. This means you have your set of measures and the supplier has, and the customer has their set of measures. And those measures are somewhat balanced. How many of you find that when you meet with your supplier or your customer, you spend about 2 hours trying to figure out whose measures to use? You want to hear an epiphany? Here's the epiphany. You're asking your questions. Who do we see performance through? Our own eyes? How many of you remember this scene from Oliver Twist? Remember what he's doing? He's coming up and asking for what? More food, to which the beetle said, no. Or are you measuring it through the eyes of your customer? How many of you use your customer's measures as yours? Why should you use your customer's measures as yours? Why should you use your customer's measures as yours? Simple. If you use your customer's measures, to what extent is there disagreement over the measures? There isn't. Number two, how do you show that you're affecting the customer? The measures prove it to them. Where did I see this? 2 years ago, I'm talking to a company, and they're located in Wisconsin. They tell the following story. They said, previously, we had a vice president who really believed that he understood better than the customer what the customer wanted. He's doing with Home Depot. What happens? Home Depot's canceled an order. He said they don't know what they're doing. By the way, the next supply chain vice president looked at the problem and said, let's use Home Depot's same measures. Suddenly, things worked. They no longer focused on the measures, they now focused on working together. And by the way, again, they start with the business model, as we pointed out. So we're starting to make sense. We've looked at the basics, we've looked at the challenges, we've looked at the new rules. So some final comments as we put things together to bed. Number one, the first thing, let me just go back. The first thing we're starting to find is when it comes to performance measurements, may you live an interesting time. These are periods of change. Performance measurements are becoming more important. And why are they becoming more important? Because what we're now measuring is more than simply cost. We're now measuring things like innovation, sustainability, responsiveness, security. By the way, little observation. How many of you right now are implementing cybersecurity systems for the supply chain? All right, you want to hear something? Cybersecurity in the supply chain is going to become extremely big within the next 5 years. Here's something, there's a study I got which came from England, and it asked the following question: what percentage of the firms have been subject to cybersecurity threats? Large firms, 93%. Small firms, 87%. But you know what's really interesting? That number represented a 50% increase from the prior year. And by the way, within your supply chain, where's the biggest opportunity for a breach? Where is the biggest opportunity? It's at your second and third tier suppliers. So right now, by the way, if you want to see where the United States is going, go to NIST, NIST, which is National Institute for Standards and Technology, and look at their cybersecurity framework. I'm going to tell you within the next 5 years, that's going to become required to do business in the States. So, what are some of the final comments we're going to have? Number one, measures and metrics are critical. You cannot run a business without them. They're confusing because there's often a lot of stuff that we don't understand. They are also changing, and our understanding of them is changing. What else are they? They're also important, and they're also now requiring different approaches. And they're critical if we're going to deal with the strategic supply chain. So what we've done in this is we've looked at 9 questions, and by looking at the 9 questions, we've gotten an opportunity to understand what's going on in terms of measures and performance measurement. And with that, by the way, before I go, I've got to give you Andy Neely's 3 laws of measures. Number 1, management has a desire to measure everything. Number 2, every measure or metric will generate an undesired or unexpected behavior. And number 3, there should be balance. Balance between long-term and short-term, making money now versus investing in the future, and outputs versus processes. So with that, we have 7 minutes, we have almost some time left. Do we have any questions? Yes, Colin.
Going right back to question 1, which is more important, strategy or performance measure.
Yes.
How can you even think of what to measure if you don't?
Okay, that's a good point. What Colin has brought up is which is important, more strategy or performance. What I was trying to get to is that people often spend a lot of time on strategy without thinking about the performance measurement issues. And you're right, you need a strategy, but the point is, a strategy that's really well articulated using measures is very powerful. That was the point I was raising. Other questions? Yes?
Steve, you talked about alignment between metrics.
Yes.
Whether they should be aligned or they should be aligned. And then I think you gave the example of the customer.
Yep.
So I think when I think about alignment, I think about alignment between a metric that customers are going to use and what they're going to use, which are perfectly aligned.
Yep.
It's a contradiction.
So what was the final piece?
I said, I don't think it's a contradiction.
Okay, it's not. But one of the things I was trying to do is to say, instead of having your metric and your customer's measures and trying to work them out so they work together, what we were doing is dropping our measures and going right to the customer. Okay, the question was asked, and it was a good question about alignment of measures, and that is, shouldn't they really be aligned? And there's not really a contradiction. The point I was trying to say is that instead of you having your measures and your customer having their measures and making sure that they fit with each other, what we were really doing is saying, let's not have our own measures, let's start using our critical customer, key customers' measures as our own. And by the way, that's one important issue. That is one reason why, as we move forward into the future, one of the most important things that you're going to start to see is the importance and need for you to understand who your key customer is. If you don't understand who your key customer is, it is difficult to set appropriate or meaningful measures. And that's one of the things I do when I go into organizations and I work with them, and I do this mainly as helping them on projects that they work on, is I always ask the question, who's your key customer and what do they want? And if you don't have a good understanding, by the way, here's the point. A key customer is not a segment. A key customer is a person. One of the best example I have is the following. In the States, we have a bicycle company by the name of Huffy. Huffy, if you ever talk to Huffy, they do not make cheap bikes. They make inexpensive bikes. There's a difference. I don't see it, but there is a difference. Where do you buy these bikes? You buy them in general mass merchandisers. Who do you think their key customer is? And this was important. Initially, I thought it was parents and kids, and it wasn't. It was store managers and purchasing agents. Why? Because you buy a Huffy bike not based on brand, but based on availability. Who makes sure that the product is available? store managers, purchasing agents, and they worked on making sure that the process and everything they did made sense to those people. Any other questions? Well, we're almost done.